Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy and this is the Locked Up Living podcast where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're really glad to be joined by Taslim Tharani. Taslim is an organisational and coaching psychologist, and she's the founder of Thriving Together, which is dedicated to fostering equity and belonging. She supports individuals to embrace their identities and thrive through transformative coaching and inclusive leadership. Really pleased to meet you again, Taslim. Welcome.
And you.
Hi there, Taz. Very nice to meet you today. Thanks a lot for coming along. So we've had a few guests on speaking about their experiences of boarding school, but your educational experience was somewhat different, wasn't it? How did you end up attending boarding school? How long did you go there for?
Yeah, I think my experience was quite different in quite a few ways. And I think I want to backtrack a little bit in terms of, I guess, just my ancestry and my upbringing, because that kind of helps to understand how we ended up in the situation where me and my sister ended up being boarding. So my parents were both born in Tanzania, and my mum moved over in the early 60s. My dad moved over in the early 70s. They met here, got married here, and had me and my sister. And so we weren't really from, and originally from India. So a few generations back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, my family's migrated from India to East Africa. And we didn't really therefore have a culture at that point of boarding school. So nobody that I knew personally, no one in my families, no one in my religious communities that I knew of had, at that time anyway, had been to boarding school or kind of really knew about it. And so it was quite an alien thing, I would say, to me anyway. But the school that I was already in, so I was already in a private girls' school. It was right the way from reception all the way to year 13. And we were day girls in that school already. So so we very much sit in that kind of still sit in that middle class space. And we're very fortunate to be in a private school, or depending how one looks at it. But yeah, already in that school. And the school that we were in was a majority day school and had a minority of boarders. And unfortunately, my family was affected by the recession in the late 80s and the early 90s. And what ended up happening is my dad particularly was struggling to find work in the UK, but he was offered a really fantastic opportunity in Uganda. So in the early 1990s, a lot of South Asians who had been kicked out of the country was starting to go back. And so there was an opportunity for my dad to go there and set up an accountancy firm. And at the time, so when I think back to how we ended up in boarding school, what I remembered before I started this kind of journey towards reflecting on these boarding school experiences was that my parents loved us very much, that they had never wanted this to happen, that it was happening because it didn't feel like there were other choices available to us. My sister really didn't want to go to school in Uganda. At that time, you could only study a maximum of 5 GCSEs, and my sister was like Oxbridge, even she was 12 at this time, but she was seen to be Oxbridge material from a very young age. And also my cultural and religious background put a huge emphasis on education, and education was seen to be so important because it was the one thing that can't be taken away. All the other things, material things in life can be taken away, but there's this real sense that if we have an education, that we're going to be able to survive in this world. And so there was a real emphasis placed on education. And I think as also people who've moved into this country, so migrated to the UK, there was also a sense of education also offers one a sense of status and stability in the country that you've moved to. And so I don't remember this, but my sister remembers being part of this decision-making process. So she remembers, essentially making that choice. And what I remember is never wanting to go into boarding school, but my mum really wanting to keep me and my sister together. And so that's how we ended up being there. And now when I speak to my mum about why did she choose to keep us in this school, and it was because of finances. So my sister got a full scholarship, which she may not have got elsewhere, and I'm pretty sure my parents were paying my school fees back for years after I left school. But the school wanted my sister, and therefore they also got me too. So it was a different entry into boarding school in that sense. And I'll pause there. I don't know if there's anything else you want me to add there, but yeah, I'll pause there.
Just clarify for me, Taz. So the boarding school, your parents had gone to Uganda, and your school was in the UK.
In the UK, yeah. So my school was called St Helens, and it was in Hillingdon, in the suburbs of London.
Oh right, yeah, I know Hillingdon. Yeah. My brother lives there. So do you think? I mean, apart from the value of education, which I think you've described very well here as education being an asset, do you think your parents thought it was important for you to go to the private boarding school as a way of protecting you from your racism?
No, I don't think I don't think that was. I think that I don't think that was even a part of the conversation. I think that it was much more around education and safety. So I think that if anything, South Asia, in the Ugandan context, if anything, it's the South Asians who are racist, because we occupied this middle space of being both, as my friend Janifa Jonker says, of being both brokers of colonialism and broken by colonialism. So we were very much had more power, definitely economically, as a community in Uganda and Tanzania and Kenya. So any racism would probably be more so from the South Asian communities towards Black people in that context. There was a lot of anti-Blackness. So I don't think that was part of the reason. I think that it was more about safety. So if you think about children, they run around, they get injured, etc. The hospitals in Uganda at that time, the infrastructure in Uganda at that time was so different to what we would have been used to in the UK. And so I think that there was a sense of, if Uganda was how it is now in the early 90s, they might have been making a very different decision. But I think in the early 90s, and especially because of the history that South Asians, I think, had faced there, I don't think it was a decision around. I don't think it was consciously a decision around racism. And in fact, racism wasn't something that I ever spoke about with my parents. It was never spoken about in our households. I think I've only started to really speak to my parents about it over the last 5 years, as I've become much more aware about how it's impacted me. And I remember, actually, just in terms of my own journey, I've always felt different in some way. Racism is such a complex thing, but I remember, my school, the school St Helens, it was pretty diverse, and I say pretty diverse because there were people from lots of different religions and lots of different cultures. We did not have many black students in the school, so you could probably count the number of Black students on 2 hands. So there was always a sense of diversity, I think, within the school that was often celebrated. It was a Church of England school, but I remember, like, at assemblies, we would celebrate all the different religious celebrations. There was a lot of encouragement to learn about different religions. My sister studied religious education at GCSE and went on to do, I think, the religious education at A-level in those days was essentially ethics and philosophy. So there was a real openness to talk about that, but racism was just not a conversation that was had. It wasn't even a word, I think, that I was necessarily fully aware of at age 10. Whereas now I look at my friends' children, who are like, 8, 10, and they will call you out if you say something that is not okay. And I don't think we had that level of awareness at all in those days. And I think that my parents, they've never spoken to me about it, but other members of my family have, that when they first moved either to the UK or Canada in the 60s and 70s, they experienced really explicit racism. And you can see that I'm much fairer skinned than a lot of Indians. So in many senses, I was more protected. I was much more white passing. People didn't really know where I was from. Whereas a lot of my cousins and family are darker skinned, and they definitely experienced a lot of racism, both in the UK and Canada, both explicit and implicit. But that wasn't directly part of my experience. And I think it's only as an adult looking back that I can see some of the structural racism that was there. And I wouldn't have known, like, some of the experiences that the students had, especially, for example, like the students from Hong Kong that came a few years later. So I started boarding in year 6, and I think a lot of the students from Hong Kong started in year 8 and year 9. And the level of racism that they experienced was really significant. So that's kind of where I think I first started to witness it and see it. But I was also part of it as well. So one of my closest friends from boarding school is from Hong Kong, and she was at a very young age able to name these things, because I think it was something that she was so explicitly experiencing. But as a British born English speaking fair enough South Asian, it was a lot more implicit for me. So I think I probably I wasn't aware of those kind of racialized experiences, I guess.
When you look back, Taslim, with the benefit of hindsight, how do you think that kind of structural racism shaped your identity and your experience?
Yeah, to be completely honest, it's really hard to know what was it about the boarding school experience and my experience in general growing up that shaped me now. And I think, again, because I was talking about this the other day with a colleague of mine, that because those experiences were so implicit, that it's really difficult to know that they even happened. And so I think, so for example, we definitely experienced favoritism. So there were definitely some students that were favoured over others. And this became more apparent, I think, in our second boarding house, more so than the first boarding house. And that really felt as if it was on racial lines. I also think because when I first started boarding, I was amongst the youngest of the boarders. So there were 6 of us in year 6. And we were the youngest initially. And then I think in the second term or something, there were 2 year 4s that then joined the boarding house. And there were only 6 of us out of like a year group of like 70 odd. And then when you went into senior school or middle school, so in year 7, it was 90 kids. And in year 7, so we had 90 kids in our year group and only 7 boarders in my year. My sister only had 3 boarders in her year. That it was. So I think the older kids, the year 9s, probably experienced it a lot more. And especially, I think it was more so experienced by people who were not born in the UK. So I think the divide seemed to be much more people who were from different ethnic backgrounds, and who also were not born in the UK. I think there was definitely an advantage to being British, being born in the UK, kind of understanding the way that things work, I guess, in the Western world. So there are other parts of my boarding school experiences that I think probably shaped me, that I can directly say, this is how this shaped me. But I think because some of this was so subtle, it's very difficult to know. From a religious perspective, which is slightly different, it's connected to racism, but slightly different, I can definitely see how this played out. So, for example, it was a Church of England school, and we did have to go to we did have to go to chapel every Sunday as full-time boarders, which I actually quite enjoyed, because being Muslim, especially the interpretation of Islam that I follow, we learn about all the Abrahamic religious leaders or prophets. And so I didn't feel there's anything wrong in me going to church, because I have a different interpretation of Jesus and his stories. But I believe, like, Jesus is one of our main prophets as well. So there were ways in which I made sense of, it didn't really matter what I was praying or what form I was praying. I'm still praying to the same God, in my perspective. I know other people might see that differently. But I wasn't able to attend my religious background. And so our prayers were on a Friday evening. And because we would come back after lights out, we weren't allowed to go. So there were those kinds of things I think the way that it impacted me on a personal level is that I became really disconnected from my own cultural background and my own religious background. And I think those were some of the things that I really missed. Like, I remember, like, going back home in the holidays, I just missed hearing my language spoken around me. And I don't understand my language. That was, like, wiped out of us from a young age. So originally we speak a dialect of Gujarati. Well, it's a mix of Gujarati and Sindh. It's called Kutchi. That was our first language. But when we started to go to nursery school, they told us that our English wasn't good enough. And in those days, obviously, this was then in the 80s, they didn't know about early childhood development and about language formation. And so my parents were encouraged to start speaking to us in English at home. And so we forgot our native and home language. So I think probably the impact of boarding school for me was much more around the disconnect between myself and my culture, or myself and my religion. And it's taken a lot of work in my adulthood to reconnect with those parts of my identity. So I think that, that going into boarding school, we obviously didn't realize it was loss and grief, but I think one of the things that I lost, and that I now as an adult have grief around, is this connection to my religious community. For example, we lost all of our friends. So if you've got friends from, going for prayers every Friday, going to a religious Saturday school that you only see on the evenings and weekends, and then you go into boarding school where essentially you don't have an opportunity to see them. And in the early 90s, there's no internet, there's no phone, there's no ways of keeping in touch. And we were in boarding school in those really pivotal years. So for me, it was between the age of 10 to 14 and a half. So that's where you're kind of really figuring out who you are, and you're growing into your identity, and your friendship groups form. And so I feel like I've lost out in terms of maintaining those types of relationships, and I've had to work really hard in my adult life to reconnect in that way.
Thank you. Where did you go in your holidays then?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and I probably am going to talk about this notion of home. So when we first started boarding school, our parents were in Uganda, and those first letters that we received, or that I still have, are all about my parents moving into their new home, like preparing it and getting it ready for us to visit. And about how much they really missed us, and them saying that, don't worry, we'll be together soon. And so our holidays were split between visiting our parents in Kampala in Uganda, and also largely going to my nanny ma's, to my mum's place. She lived in southwest London. So in half terms and visiting weekends, we would usually go to her. And then in the bigger holidays, either my parents would come to the UK, or we would go to.
Thank you. Right. It sounds like you had a very busy life. So you've mentioned your sister, of course, who was a bit older than you and got a scholarship to the school. Was it a great help to you having her presence there?
I think it was a massive help, but it was also, it also tore us apart as well. I think that I was a child who really needed home. I was one of those children who didn't have confidence, and who needed their parent to sit with them while they were doing their homework, and who needed that validation or that encouragement. And my sister was under a lot of pressure, essentially, to take on that role. But she was in year 7, so she started boarding school at that transition from junior school to middle school, and so she had transitioned into year 7, and she had, because we weren't around that summer, she didn't connect with her school friends that summer, and so they had formed like different groups and different cliques, and so she was, having this massive transition. And literally from the first day, she only had three boarders in her year. From the first day, one of the boarders who shared the same birthday with her decided that she didn't like my sister. So for the first 2 years of the boarding school life, my sister was ignored by the 2 girls that she was living with. And one would think that the house mistresses would see what was happening and allow, for example, me and my sister to share a room, or to allow us to be a support to each other. But actually, the systems are designed in such a way that you are encouraged to be emotionally independent from a very, very young age. And so my sister experienced a lot of pressure from me and my parents. She felt that she was going through a lot and she had nobody to share it with. I was her baby sister. And as much as I would have wanted her to share it with me, she didn't feel that she could. And so there were moments where we could have a sense of home. So like, I remember on weekends, like, she knew a lot more about the religious education than I did, and so we would sing our versions of hymns that are called Ginans together. But it really put a huge strain on our relationship, because she would be my go-to person when I was being bullied, or when I was being hurt, or when I was being harmed, and she pretty much had no one. And so we, again, in our adulthood, have really invested in our relationship. So my parents had kept us together because she had really hoped that would make us close. But unfortunately, it drove us apart. And I think my sister, understandably, as a child herself, had a lot of resentment towards me for leaning on her as much as I did. So we've worked really hard in our adulthood to really foster a really healthy adult relationship with each other. And we've both kind of been on our own, and are still kind of in our own journeys.
So, I mean, that sounds really painful, actually, Taz. So I'm glad to hear that you've been working on that relationship with your sister. What is the age gap between the two?
So we're 1 year, 9 months, and I'm June born and she's September born. So academically, we were only 1 year apart. And because my sister, it was really difficult, because my sister then didn't have any boarding school friends in her year. So her choices in terms of friendships were either people older than her or people younger than her. So that was, I guess, just quite an interesting thing. But I wanted to circle back, actually, because you said that it was painful. And part of my healing has actually been around looking. I don't have that many memories of boarding, actually. So I've got very few memories pre-boarding. So that kind of going to boarding school was clearly very traumatic for me, because I don't have that many memories of my early childhood. But I also don't have that many memories of boarding either. And so there's a lot that I don't remember. So part of this kind of healing journey for me has been trying to put together a narrative, because I don't have the memories to formulate a narrative. I've got those emotional memories, but I don't have the kind of stories that go alongside it. And some of the boarding school reports talked about things like, so one of them in year 7 said, Taslim has settled well this term after a very upsetting beginning of the year. She still lacks self-confidence and relies heavily on her sister. And that was written the term that my grandfather died. And so when I looked back on it, I just thought, gosh, that just sounds really harsh. And my sister was like, Taslim, you do realise that was the year that our Bapuji died. And so it was like relying on my sister was not okay. And then it was like a sense of achievement that I didn't rely on her. So then later in the year, the summer report said Taslim has become less reliant on Amira. So there was this real message, I think, that we received around, you're in this alone. You are alone in this, that it's not okay to rely on anyone else except your friend, except yourself. And at the same time, they also made it very clear in my report. They said things like boarding school is something to be tolerated by Taslim rather than enjoyed. And they also said in my report, Taslim appears not to have a close friend. So it starts to build up this picture of this child who was probably incredibly afraid and also like incredibly alone as well.
Yes, and I mean, I noticed earlier on you used the phrase emotionally independent, I think you said, which of course might be framed differently in terms of being emotionally cut off or emotionally frozen, which of course doesn't mean that the emotions or the feelings aren't there or have gone away, but somehow they're difficult to feel in touch with.
And I think this is what's so fascinating about boarding school, because a lot of people will talk about how the only route to survival is to cut off your emotions, that the only way to survive is to essentially abandon the self, and that is the way to survive in this kind of a context. And I think I failed miserably at that, to be honest. I was such a sensitive, emotionally aware child. I was always someone who was caring and compassionate, and that's something else that I saw in my reports from my like classroom teacher. I can't remember what you call them, but like, so always like Taslim is a kind-hearted, gentle girl, or she's good-natured, sensitive, and caring. And there's no way that I could turn that off. It was such a significant part of who I was. And so that then became my coping mechanism. So I didn't end up being so I did still abandon myself, but I abandoned myself not in terms of emotionally. I mean, I did to an extent, but it was more around, well, how do that if I take care of other people, and if everyone else is okay, I'm not going to get bullied. I'm not going to get hurt. So my kind of coping mechanism was I abandoned my wants and my needs and prioritize other people's, so that I wouldn't be, I was still bullied, but so that I wouldn't be bullied in that way. But I think the boarding school is highly skilled at, what I noticed in my school reports was that being mature. So my school reports often talked about me being immature, and what they meant by that is that I cried and I showed emotion. And so there was something about crying and showing emotion means that you are not mature, and that is not okay. And as I stopped showing more emotion, I started to get reports that said she's maturing, she's growing. But the only way that I learned how to shut my emotions off was through depression. So I became an anxious and depressed child very quickly. Obviously, that wasn't in the 90s. No one really knew about this. But I had my first bout of major depression in 2004, just before my 21st birthday. And the depression was so severe that I was not able to string a sentence together. So I was so cognitively impacted by that depression. And at the time, I was in complete denial that this was due to my boarding school experiences. I was not willing to go there when I had therapy. But now I can look back and say such a big part of that first bout of depression was because that was my way of succeeding and turning off my emotions. I couldn't cut them off in any other way. It was just in my nature to be warm and kind and caring and sensitive emotionally. But what didn't happen was having the support as a preteen moving into the teenage years to learn those self-regulatory skills. There was no one in those boarding houses that offered children or taught children how to regulate and how to deal with their emotions. And I think that's it's just a devastating thing. And I think coming back to this notion of, what was boarding school like? And I think in many ways, me and my sister were actually homeless. We didn't have a physical home. We didn't know what our home looked like in Uganda. We weren't residents of Uganda. So every time we'd go for the holidays, it was our home because that's where our parents were. But now as adults, like that can never be our home. We aren't, my parents are permanent residents, me and my sister aren't. And so, but I think what happens is that you go into boarding school and you're told that it's homesickness. But after reading books like Mark Stibble's Home at Last and Joyce Shavarian's book, it is so clear to me that homesickness is essentially that real sense of homelessness, and it's significant grief and loss that is just brushed over by keeping children really busy.
That's really powerful to hear, Taslim. And I was thinking as you were talking about how the school seemed to be pathologising kind of normal human experience. And we've interviewed a few people on the subject of boarding school, as you know. One of our guests, Simon Partridge, he's spoken about how he came from a family where, generations had gone to boarding school. It was part of their heritage, and how childcare was to some degree farmed out to nannies before you went to boarding school. And I wonder whether that process of cutting off for some children has already begun before they even go to boarding school. But you perhaps went as a more intact person to boarding school, but then found it a harsher experience.
Yeah, I think that, I resented my parents for so many years, but they are such brilliant parents. I think that had the boarding school or that financial crash not happened, all families go through ups and downs, and there are challenges in those relationships. But my mum was very up until boarding school, my sense is that she was very emotionally aware, and so she's always been a parent that you could tell her anything and she would be there to help you work through it. And she grounded our relationships on trust. And so that was really interesting in terms of boarding, because I think there was also a cultural thing here as well. So, for example, when you move into teenage girls and you start shaving your legs or whatever it is, like we were grown up in our culture, we would wax rather than shave. And I remember having quite a lot of peer pressure about shaving, because as an Indian girl, even though I'm fair skinned, very hairy. And I said, I will not shave my legs. My mum doesn't want me to do it. And that trust it was more important to me that my mum trusted me than kind of anything else. And I think in some ways that gave me strength, but it also meant that I was set apart from other people because I didn't engage in a lot of the quote unquote naughty things or experimentational things that children in boarding schools, or just children in general, work through or move through. I kind of kept myself apart in a way. So, but yeah, I think that's probably that. I think there's probably some truth in that. But and especially for me, I don't know how my sister would feel, but I was so close to my mum. I probably had a bit of an anxious attachment to her, probably from a young age. I was such a shy, socially anxious child that it would take me time to warm up in spaces. So I meet people now that I don't remember from my childhood, but they remember me, and they're like, oh yeah, we used to come to your house all the time. And they were like, but you never used to play with us, you were always with your mum. And so for me, I think that separation from her was so significant, because she was my safe space, my safe person. And I think sadly for her, she never ever wanted this to be what happened to her children. And so this situation was also deeply traumatic for her. And that meant that we, as a family, we just didn't know how to navigate this at an emotional level. We didn't have the emotional literacy, I think, even in society that we have now. 30 years ago, that didn't exist. So my mum didn't have the resources to help her with her own emotions, so that she had capacity for us as well. So I think that was, quite a challenging thing to experience.
So you moved on, Tass, to become a day pupil.
Yes.
Did you prefer that?
So this is so interesting. I found that transition really difficult, which was really surprising because I was the child who I think wanted to stop boarding from the day that I started it. And what my mum said to me more recently, that I think after the first or second term, I stopped asking, so I stopped saying it. She said, "You only talked about it initially." So there was clearly at some level, I realised it wasn't going to happen. And I think I then found a way to accept the situation. And my identity in the school was as a boarder. And so, and the transition out of boarding was really sudden, and I wasn't, as it often is the case in boarding school context, you are not kept in the loop of what's happening. So my sister had just turned 16, and she's given permission. Well, she said before I came on this that I could share anything that was helpful to share, so I thought that was incredibly generous of her. And she was going through a really tough time, and it got towards the kind of Christmas holidays, and she essentially had a complete breakdown. So she was taken out of the school environment, and she went to stay with my nanny mum, my mum's sister, for a couple of weeks. So all I was told is that she's unwell, and so she's staying with a relative. And so we went on holiday. We broke up. I left for our Christmas holidays earlier that term. And it was it was on that Christmas holiday that my mum said, "I'm coming back to London. I'm taking you girls out of boarding school," because and that decision was made because of what my sister was going through. So I think for me, I really resented it because I was like, well, why is it that when you see, and this was a story between me and my sister, I was very extroverted, and so and now I realize I've also had ADHD, and so I'm incredibly expressive, and I don't hide that expression. So my parents, it's not quite crying wolf, but my parents were, and still are, used to me being very expressive emotionally. My sister was not expressive emotionally at all. So when my sister showed any kind of emotion, there was this move to protect. And I'm not saying my parents didn't protect me, but they saw me sharing my emotions as meaning they didn't have to. Whereas with my sister, and so I think I was really angry and really resentful. And then what happens, because if you're in a school which is majority day school and you're minority boarders, and now we're heading into our teenage years, right? I'm 14 and a half. I'm in year 10. All my friends at school, they're going out with each other after school. They're meeting up on weekends. We've got restrictions. We're not able to do that as much or as often. So your friends become the kids in boarding school. Now, I didn't have that many close friends in boarding school. It was incredibly volatile. It was a really awful situation, but I had an identity and I had a sense of belonging. When I stopped boarding, it was like everyone forgot. So people didn't realize that I was a day girl. I was still pretty shy. I wasn't particularly confident. And I didn't know how to socialize. Like, kids at 14, 15, 16 start going to parties, and I think I didn't have that socialization in terms of our boarding school experience. So I found that transition really, really difficult. Yeah.
Where were you living?
So we lived still in northwest London. So my mum got a flat, and we went in a flat in northwest London, and then we rented a flat for a period of time, and then we bought a house.
So, but you were on your own, or your mother had come back? Or?
No, so my mum came back. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I see.
Yeah, so my mum came back and took us out of boarding.
So Taslim, how did going to boarding school shape you as an adult, do you think?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we actually haven't talked about is a sense of home. And I'd quite like to circle back a little bit onto that before I talk about how it shaped me as an adult. That I think as I started approaching this healing journey, which I'll talk more about in a bit, it really became apparent to me that I did not have a sense of home. I didn't have a sense of home internally, and I didn't have a sense of home externally either. And I think that boarding school, in many ways, it's been helpful in some ways, but it's meant that I have existed in these in-between or liminal spaces in terms of my identities, in terms of many of my identities, but also in the sense of like stability or not having stability. So I think in terms of how it's shaped me as an adult, it's really difficult to explain. I think what it has resulted is in me searching for belonging, and that's almost been like searching for home, searching for belonging, searching for relationships, searching for connection. And what's happened in my adulthood, both in terms of my personal life and in terms of my professional life, is relationships have become the most important thing to me. So I invest in a lot of time and energy in my relationships, both in my personal and family life, as well as in my professional life. I think the other thing is that I've been on a real journey. So I would say initially as an adult or as a teenager coming into adulthood, I didn't really have a sense of identity. I think I didn't know who I was. I knew what my values were. I think my religious education and background, and probably my relationship with my parents, offered me some consistency, and that consistency came through my values and what I care about. But I think in terms of other types of identity, there was a lot of feeling of lost and confused. And I think that things that I learned in boarding school, I found as an adult were no longer serving me. So, for example, I did become a people pleaser because that was the way that I stopped myself from being bullied. So one of the people who I now very, very good friends with, I saw her as, when we were children, as my main bully in boarding school, and she saw me as a sibling type of friendship where we just bickered a lot because we were like sisters. And when I look back on it, I was like, well, that makes sense because I was there for her as a friend so that I wouldn't be attacked or bullied. And now we are actually genuinely really, really good friends, which is really lovely. But people pleasing doesn't get you very far in the organizational setting. It can be a recipe for disaster. I've had to unlearn that behavior, and I would say I'm still unlearning that behavior now. And the second thing is definitely as a teenager in my early 20s, I didn't know who I was, what I wanted, what my needs were, and my views and my opinions. And I remember one summer going to stay with family friends in Canada, and any time they'd ask me a question, I said, I don't know, and I don't mind. And I think part of that journey to where I am now has been a relearning of that identity. So it's been about that real sense of identity synthesis and integration, and learning that actually I do have very strong opinions. I do have a mind of my own. I can make decisions. And yeah, so I think that that environment has influenced me or conditioned me, and I'm in that process of that kind of unlearning and unconditioning to actually become who I am and who I want to be in this world. And in addition to that, I think that it has primed me for really caring about justice. Like, I really care about equity. I really care about justice. I really care about fairness. And I think I've always cared about those things. Like, even pre-boarding school, I was always that person that if anyone was being mean to somebody else, I'd stand up for that person. I would find it really difficult to stand up for myself. And I think that's still probably true of me now. But I would say that having felt or experienced lots of what felt like injustices, that has become really important to me. And then the third thing is actually love. I often describe boarding school as spending 9 months of the year completely void of any adult love. It's a cold environment. It's a cold, toxic environment that's about survival. It's not about thriving. It's not about aliveness. And I think that has also shaped, therefore, what I want as an adult. And also what I hope my coaching clients experience from me, that they experience, we might not use the words love in organizational settings, but that they experience understanding, they experience compassion, they experience empathy, they experience encouragement, they experience like someone really rooting for them and really believing in them. And I guess I very much sit in that wounded healer space, that my response to all of this has been caring for others. And I think that wounded healer can be dangerous if there is an insight around it. But I also think that there's something about, as psychologists, it's really important to own that part of our wounding that has shaped who and how we want to practice and what's important to us in the work that we do as well.
Some really interesting observations there, Taslim, especially around kind of like thinking about the concept of home. And as we spoke previously, didn't we? And I explained that I didn't go to boarding school, but I moved like every year or two as a consequence of my dad's job, which then meant that the home was the family, but there wasn't a stable house. And you do end up with the wrong accent, the wrong uniform, the wrong interests because of having to constantly change. So I think family values and the culture of the family, if you like, do become really important, which I think then can mean that ends up being what defines you really, is the belief in things like equality or making sure that there's a level of compassion, those kind of things, that you have to hold on to those things more than perhaps somebody might do if they've had constant, consistency across their life. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about your experiences. How did you? I mean, you've mentioned your healing journey a few times. What kind of things have you done that have helped you heal? What's contributed to you recovering from that early trauma?
So it's been a number of things, and I think well, the trigger for me recognizing or allowing myself to know that there was trauma here was actually the death of my mindfulness teacher. So my mindfulness teacher, her name was Cindy Cooper. I think I was experiencing healing working with her without even realizing that was what was happening, that there was trauma being healed without at an unconscious level, not at a conscious level. And when she died in March 2017, the grief around her death essentially triggered all this unresolved childhood grief and trauma. So I think this healing journey would not have happened. That was almost like the gift her death gave me, in a way, that this healing journey probably wouldn't have happened so explicitly without having access to something that I was feeling as a child. And I think her death really allowed some of those emotions that I had been in denial around to emerge. And I think, and so some of those emotions were around terror. It was fear of being left behind. It was fear of not being believed. It was a fear of being lost. So I became quite agoraphobic. So even if I knew exactly where I was going, but if I was on a crowded train, it would be that terror of I'm not going to be found. I'm going to be lost. And I actually think that insight, so those emotions coming up didn't make sense in terms of my current experiences, but they were, as I started learning about PTSD, they were essentially emotional flashbacks. So what I started to learn is that some of what I was experiencing was giving me insight and clues into some of the things that I might have been experiencing in boarding school. And I started to explore this a little bit more. So I was Googling boarding school, and I came across boarding school syndrome. I came across Nick Duffel's work, Joy Shavarian's work. I came across this Facebook group called Boarding School Survivors. And that kind of started this journey of healing, but it had to come with the first point is acknowledging that this happened, and acknowledging that this thing that happened was traumatic for me and did have an impact. So there were lots of different things that I think supported my healing journey. I had therapy, there was my own research, there was reading books. I mean, I was so struck by some of the books that I read. I'm trying to keep this short, but this was the stuff that I was really hoping we were going to spend most of the time on. So I feel like I've got a lot to say. Is it okay if I talk and then you might have to cut things down later? Because I realised I'm assuming that we were going to be an hour and we've got like 7 minutes to go. But so the first book I read was Home at Last by Mark Stibbe. Stibbe, thank you. And I remember I cried throughout the whole book. I could not put it down. It was the first book that I read. And although I didn't experience physical abuse, he talked a lot about his physical abuse. There was something in that book that really resonated with my experience. And I think it gave me insight into how there was such a void of love during those four and a half years. And then I started reading more. So I read Joyce Shavarian's book, and that's where I learned about the homelessness that I think that I was experiencing, what homesickness really was. I read Nick Duffell's book, but I found that really difficult to read. He focused more on the boys' experience, so his stuff didn't resonate as much with me. But what I did take away from his book is around how borders end up working in institutions. And you and I talked about that, about how I ended up in academia, potentially. And then Nikki Simpson's book came out later, so a bit after I'd already started this experience, this journey. And I found her book actually the hardest to read. Her book is a compilation of lots of different women's experiences of boarding school, and I haven't managed to get through it yet. But what I did notice is that as I was reading the book, there'd be moments when I would get more emotional, or moments when I would find myself crying. And when those tears came, I was like, this is a clue. This is telling me something about my own experience that I'm not yet aware of, because I'm having an emotional response to it. So that was really powerful. The other really powerful thing, I think, was I watched a lot of documentaries. So there were documentaries in the 90s around boarding schools, and there was one that focused on girls' boarding schools, and there was one that focused on boys' boarding schools. And that also was, again, part of that healing process, because I was seeing it from, I guess, an adult's perspective, and I could see the harm that happened in those contexts and could relate that to my own memories. I think reading my school reports was a massive help, because it kind of, again, just helped me tell the truth to myself about what that experience was actually like. And I spent a lot of time journaling as well. So I journaled a lot. But I think the biggest thing in terms of that healing journey has been about allowing myself to grieve. I think that there's something around telling myself the truth about what I experienced, and actually how horrific it really was, and allowing myself to grieve the childhood that I didn't get to have. And doing a lot of work with, I guess, just with my little Taz, and giving her the love that she didn't receive, and really allowing her to be witnessed and validated and seen as well. So I think that all of those things have, really, really supported me. And then having other people who've experienced similar things as well. So I actually think that Facebook group, bizarrely, has also been really helpful, because I joined it when there were very few members. So I post a lot less now. It's grown a lot. I don't know how many members they have now, but initially, when there was like 100 or 200 members, there was a lot of kind of sharing of experiences on there, and I found that quite cathartic as well. And then I think reconnecting with my friend who was there as well, because she has so many more memories than me, so she could fill in a lot of blanks. And I also think being a psychologist really helps, because it means that I've got an emotional vocabulary. I've got things to help me make sense of those experiences. But you can't make sense of those experiences when they remain hidden, or when they remain, when they're so repressed that you don't even know that they exist. So I think part of that journey has been allowing them to come to the surface so that they can then be worked on and worked through.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear about your journey, and also reminded that quite a lot of our listeners are people who work with people in institutions and not institutions that we associate with privilege, but prisons, secure hospitals. And very commonly in their histories, of course, they've been removed from their families, spent time in care, they've been in children's homes or other sort of secure children's accommodation, and that question of what's home and how that shapes you is something that probably in many cases gets glossed over a little bit, because actually there's often other traumas like physical abuse and sexual abuse are very, very common for people in those kind of institutions, but actually just the removal and not having the fact that you don't have a home to call your own, I think that's kind of underrated really in terms of how impactful that can be as an experience.
I think there's two things for me anyway, and I don't know whether this will resonate with people who've, like you say, been in care or been taken away from their homes, but is the complete lack of control and autonomy that you feel in those moments. And we know how important, if we think about our the threat system, that safety comes with also feeling like we've got a bit of a sense of control or some autonomy. We've got some agency or some decision-making authority. And I think that what happens is your agency is completely taken away. And obviously in contexts like prisons, and I'm not familiar with that context at all, but you don't have as much agency. You've got some agency over choices that you make day to day. But I imagine earlier on in childhood, there was something about that agency not being there, and therefore a lot of the things that we end up doing is around how do we pull back and gain that kind of sense of control and autonomy. And I think there's something that I haven't talked about, because I personally, I mean, everyone functions on a level of power in some way, shape or form, but I'm not, I don't know how to, but I think there's something about power as well, that you feel so helpless and powerless in those situations. Then a lot of the way of dealing or coping with that is about how do I gain power? How do I gain control? And often that can become around power over other people. And I think that's, so I think that's kind of part of what people may experience. And also how hard it is that when you then have opportunities for stability, whatever that looks like, how hard it is to sustain it, because it is so new and so alien, and it's not something that people maybe have experienced before. I mean, again, for a really different context, but it takes me years to unpack just simple things like, I've spent a lot of time living out of trunks and suitcases, so I take my life with me when I go somewhere. Like I'm not a light packer. I take everything with me. I take home with me where I go. But I also find it really hard to settle into homes or spaces. So I've been in my flat now since 2019. I still have unpacked boxes. I don't have any of my pictures up on the wall yet, so they're just like my paintings are leaning against the wall. It's really hard to find ways to settle into places of stability as well.
Well, yes, I think we're probably getting towards the time when we should be winding up, but it's probably worth mentioning as we draw to an end that you're now an organisational psychologist, aren't you? How have your experiences shaped your movement towards this role and this profession?
I mean, I think there've been lots of different influences on how I've ended up being in this profession. I think the boarding school experiences probably shape how I want to be in my role as a psychologist, rather than my choice of becoming a psychologist. I think if people met me when I was before boarding school, I was going to end up being in some kind of caring profession, because that was what my nature was even pre-boarding. But I think it's probably some of the things that we've already touched on, which is this sense of who I am and how I show up is really important. I think that actually my experiences and the trauma and the healing means that I don't know how to explain it. I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. When I first finished my degree, I wanted to go down the clinical and counselling route. And I realised quite quickly that I didn't want to work with people in this space, but I wanted to work with people kind of in this space. And so instead of going down the clinical and counselling route, I ended up going down the organisational psychology and coaching route. And I think that, and so I always knew I wanted to work one-to-one with people, that I wanted to work, in many ways, people who had been through difficulties and challenges like myself, and to help people, I guess, navigate the complexities in the world that we face. But I also think that my experiences of being institutionalized from a young age has enabled me to have some awareness of bigger systems that we navigate as human beings. And I'm going to name them, and they might be quite jarring for some people, but Bell Hooks talks about these 4 systems. So she talks about patriarchy, white supremacy culture, imperialism, and capitalism. And I think that now, where I am now with my work, is it straddles these areas. So it straddles our individual level experiences in terms of my one-to-one coaching. And that kind of like what we talked about before, that empathy that I can bring, but also that kind of team level and people dynamics as well, and really understanding, I guess, how people can end up, like what kinds of experiences people have had that, and this is all psychologists obviously are aware of this, but really curious about how have people ended up who they are today, what have been the kinds of things in their lives that have really influenced them. And therefore, what then happens when people, with everything that they come together in a space and try to work on something together, that organizational context and how much that organizational context can impact on individuals, and then those broader systems that are also at play. And so I think that all the experiences that I've had, I guess, have resulted in, just me being really curious about all of these things. That wasn't a very succinct response, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so we probably need to wrap it up now. But I just wanted to say, because you have mentioned Mark's a couple of times there, and actually we were due to have him on. We were due to meet with him a few weeks ago, and then unfortunately we've had to delay that. But anyone who's listening and has found Taslim's conversation interesting, we do have a conversation coming up soon with Mark also. So please follow us to catch that one as well when it's published. But really great to hear your reflections on your life and your experiences, Taslim. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much indeed. It's great to meet you.
Thank you.